Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone here to today's webinar on overcoming barriers to international trade, an introduction to export controls and export licenses. This is the first of a four-part series we're hosting with the Export Controls organisation on the topics of export controls and all the topics advertised. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Digital Content Manager at Open to Export. We are a government-supported online community helping small UK businesses get ready to sell overseas. We do this through our step-by-step guides and articles, our regular webinar programme, our RTA Experts Forum, and our relatively new Export Action Plan tool. You can ask questions at any point during the webinar using the question box on the right-hand side of the control panel. We'll get to as many of these as we can at the end, and any of the questions we don't get to in the session today, we will be posting to our RTA Experts Forum, and we're assigning them to your users should you be registered with us in the week or so following the webinar. This should allow you to get answers straight to your email inbox within a few days. We don't typically share the slides in the presentation, but we will be recording today's session and sending you a copy of it within the next few days, and also uploading it to our website. So please have a look on the site for the recording. So, leading the presentation today, we have Claire Harrison and Trevor Wood from the Export Controls organisation. Claire is Head of Business Awareness at the ECO, delivering training courses across the UK for UK businesses, working closely with UKTI and trade associations. Trevor is also similarly experienced, has been working in 25 years with Export Controls, and is former head of a licensing group at the Export Control organisation. He runs various workshops on how to use checking tools and how to use Spire as well. So definitely two very expert speakers covering what is actually a very important topic for first-time exporters to really look into and make sure they know about and make sure they approach it in the right way. Because otherwise you can get some hassle later on as you actually come to the nitty-gritty of exporting your product. So hopefully this webinar and this webinar series will be very useful for you. And without further ado, I'm delighted to hand over to Claire and Trevor.
Hello, thanks very much for that introduction, William. It's very helpful. Hi everyone. This is the first time I've done one of these webinar productions, so I'm hoping everything will go well. And what we're hoping to do this afternoon is to give you a very good high-level overview of what export controls is all about. The first to say, on the first slide, please, William, I'm putting up an overview here of a few items of export. It's fair to say that exports leave the UK every single day of the year. In 2014, the value of the total of UK exports was something in the region of £515 billion. Only 15 billion of that was subject to export control. So it's fair to say that there's only about 3% of exports that actually do require export license coverage. However, what we're going to do today is to take you through what types of items and what types of exports actually do require a license and give you some really good practical advice as to how to obtain those licenses and to find out whether you need a license in the first place. On top of those defence and security exports, we've got something called dual-use exports and dual-use items. Some of you may have heard this term, some may not. So today, Trevor and I are going to explain in full detail what dual-use exports are. Okay, next slide, William, please. This is my first introduction for you to the website of Export Control. It's on the gov.uk platform. We've got about 50 pages on export control that you can use to help yourselves to understand more about the subject. This page is all about customs. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs is responsible for enforcing export control legislation. And one thing you must bear in mind, that if export control procedure is not followed, your shipments can be detained for inspection by UK Border Force. This particular container, in the slide I'm showing you here, is being detained for search. And if required, Customs will refer to the Export Control Organisation to see whether a licence is required. What we don't want to happen is that this happens to you is that this happens to your exports. What will happen, obviously, is your goods will be delayed while they are being inspected at the port. And if the goods are detained, you could also be liable to some sort of customs charge. Next slide, William, and we'll have a look here at other types of enforcement that HMRC put into place. This is dependent on whether it's a first-time breach of export control or repeated breaches of export control. But HMRC and the Crown Prosecution Service have got the powers to enforce the export control legislation. Some of these are quite serious. Some of them start with penalties, financial penalties, based on the value of the goods that are in the actual shipment, which could be quite high, and serious cases of breach of export control can result in high fines and in some cases prison sentences. Suffice to say, we don't want this to happen to you. So let's take you through how you know whether or not you need to have an export license. Next slide, please, William. I've already showed you what the gov.uk site looks like. This is another page on the gov.uk website. This is where you can start to find out whether you need to have an export license or not. And export controls is something that you should build in to your export markets and your export marketing strategy right at the very beginning. When you're thinking about what markets you should be trading with, whether or not you need an agent to get your goods into those markets, and determining how you're going to get paid, you also need to be thinking about an export license. And because you have to apply for those, you should ensure you've got plenty of time to get the license, and please don't leave it to the last minute. One of the things I always say to the exporters that I deal with is make sure that when you're actually negotiating delivery times, you have in mind the question of whether you need to have an export license. Please don't promise unsustainable delivery dates if you haven't got your license in place. Next slide, please, William. So how do you know whether or not you need that license in the first place? It's all based on a series of something called export controls. And what we're looking at here is a series of elements. It's a question of the items that you're actually going to be exporting. You need to know whether any of the goods, or the items, or the software are on a control list. Trevor will be taking you through that in some detail in a minute. You also need to bear in mind where your export is going to be going to. There are several countries in the world which are subject to sanction and embargo. If you're exporting to a country that's subject to sanction, you'll need to know how to trade with that country. Another thing you need to bear in mind is who's going to be using your goods, who the end user is. Have you checked to see whether your end user is on a designated party list? If they're on a designated party list, there will be issues about whether you can export to them. And finally, you also need to have a think about the actual intended use of the export. There may be concerns about where the goods are going to be going to, who's using them. They may be ending up in a terrorist cell, and there may be concerns about such things as weapons of mass destruction. Next slide, please, William. I work for the Export Control Organisation, and the Export Control Organisation is part of the Department for Business Innovation and Skills. We're based in 1 Victoria Street in London, and we are the UK statutory authority for military export licensing. If you need to get an export licence, you can only get a licence from a control organisation. Under the EU Dual-Use Goods Regulation 428 of 2009, the Export Control Organisation is also the competent licensing authority for dual-use exports, and we will have a look at what those dual-use goods are in a minute. When you get your licence from us, all licences will be issued in the name of the BIS Secretary of State. we're now going to have a look at some of the controls that you will need to be considering. Next slide, please, William.
Okay, thank you, Claire. We're going to look now at the control lists, and the starting point, if you need to know whether your goods need an export license, is to look at the strategic export control lists. You can see on the screen a PDF document that you can download from the Export Control Organisational website, and that contain all of the goods that are subject to export control. The lists are updated at least twice a year, and you can see from the slide the current version was updated in December 2015. The list contains several different types of goods. We have military goods, we have dual-use goods that Claire has already spoken about, and we'll be going into that on the next slide. There are also some controls on what are called torture goods, things that could be used for human rights abuses, and some radioactive sources that are subject to control. You can also see from this slide that there are almost 300 pages on those export control lists, so sometimes it can be a little difficult to navigate your way through. But in essence, the message is, if your goods are listed somewhere on the strategic export control lists, then you will need a license for them to send them to most parts of the world. Next slide, please, William. So let's have a look at the types of goods that are subject to control. The easier to understand are military goods. So I've shown a picture there of a battle tank. That is going to be subject to control. It's a military item. It's been originally designed for military use and will need a license for its export. As well as items that have been originally designed for military use, any item that has been modified for military use will be listed on the military list as well. So we may have a commercial item. The military has seen it, think this is really good, we could use this, if you could only change something in it, like the frequency of operation or some of the physical characteristics. If they define a change to that, then that item has been modified for military use and will also be considered on the military list. The way the military list operates is that if your main item is controlled, then any specially designed part of that will also be controlled. So while the tank's controlled, so will any other item, perhaps in the driver's cockpit, whatever it may be and however small it may be, will also be controlled. A dual-use item is something that's been designed for commercial use, but then can be used by commercial end users or by military end users, hence two uses, dual use. That's why it's called dual use. Now these tend to cover the highest technology items, the fastest, the latest, the biggest, whatever it may be. But again, it covers items that can be useful to the military or can be used in weapons of mass destruction applications, and that's why we have items on the list. You can find that a dual-use item of this type can even have higher technology content than the equivalent military item, and that's why they are subject to export control. Also, all of the dual-use items in the dual-use list is written with technical specifications, and so you will be having to compare the specifications of your goods against the list to determine whether your items are actually subject to control. And this means that only about 1% of dual-use items out of all of them that are available will be subject to control. Next slide, please, William. So there we see the military list. We won't dwell on this for too long, but there are 22 categories, ML1 to ML22. The first 20 cover actual goods, actual items. So our tank that we just saw would be controlled under ML6 as a vehicle. There are some other larger categories there. ML9 covers all military vessels and any specially designed component. ML10 covers any military aircraft and specially designed component. And you may even just be providing something that's going to be turned into a military item, such as a forging or a casting. If it's already been designed to become part of a military item, even if it isn't in its final form, that could still be subject to export control. And then in ML21, any software that relates to those military items is controlled. And equally, ML22, any technology that relates to those items will also be controlled. Next slide, please, William. But let's have a look at some of these dual-use goods. Now, the dual-use list is split into 10 categories. And I've got some examples here from each of the categories. Now, some are quite specialist, but some will be more likely to relate to some of the businesses that you're involved in. Start with category 0. This is nuclear, and it is quite special. It's things that are specially designed really for a nuclear reactor. And we see a fuel rod there. Category 1 covers special materials. And I've shown there some aluminium tubes. Now, not all aluminium tubes are controlled. It's only those that operate at a certain strength and can operate at a certain speed, turn speed, which is why they need that strength. So if you had some of these, you would have to look at the specification and then go and look at the control list and compare them against the parameters on the control list. And obviously, if you met or exceeded those parameters, that's when you would need an export license. Category 2 is materials processing. This is looking at machines that can process normally metals, but other materials too, to form another component. And the most accurate machine tools are subject to control. And this is because they can be used for making parts for military systems or parts for weapons of mass destruction systems. For category 3, which is electronics, I'm showing a microprocessor. If that operates at certain temperature ranges, then that will be controlled. And other integrated circuits are subject to control as well. Category 4 covers computers. These days it tends to be very high performance computers. Gone are the days when office laptops will be controlled. But if you've got a very high performance computer or a parallel computer, then that may be subject to control. You may need to look on the control list. Category 5 is split into 2 parts. The first part looks at telecommunications and equipment that can be used there. I'm showing some optical fibers there. So again, it's not every optical fiber. The types that are used in standard transmission systems won't be controlled. But those that are very high strength and could be useful in military systems are on the control list. Next slide, please, William. And then in the second half of Category 5 Part 2, we have encryption systems. And this can cover lots of equipment that contains encryption. We have computer servers, routers, some other basic equipment. If it has encryption, you will probably need to look at the encryption controls in Category 5 Part 2. Category 6 covers sensors and lasers, and one of the things that covers are infrared cameras or night vision cameras. Again, this is quite a key military technology, and so there are parameters on commercial systems that might meet those levels, and they will be subject to export control. Category 7 covers navigation and avionics, and that is basically accelerometers, gyroscope that we're showing there, or an inertial navigation system that can help to guide an aircraft or other type of vehicle. Category 8 covers marine, and it's mainly submarine equipment. In the picture there is a submersible vehicle that will be used for undersea exploration, could be used in the oil and gas industry, but equally could be used by the military, and the accessories for it. So we see some manipulator arms on the submersible that you have there. And then finally, Category 9 is aerospace and propulsion. So that will cover aero engines, gas turbine engines, covers rocket motors, and other things associated with propulsion. Now, for all of those items that I've shown, they're all controlled by the parameters of the equipment. And typically, they're at quite a high level. They have to be useful in some military or weapons of mass destruction application. And so you will need to look at the specifications of your items and compare them to the relevant entries on the control lists. Next slide, please, will you? In addition to the goods, software and technology is also controlled. And as a rule of thumb, you could say that if the goods are controlled, any software or any technology related to those goods would also be controlled. And we're controlling here both tangible software and technology, i.e. documents you might send through the post, or software you might send on a disk or on a stick, as well as intangible software and technology. And that's how most of it is transferred these days, through the internet or through emails, etc. So again, any software or technology relating to licensable goods would also be licensable. Next slide, please, William. So here's a few examples. Question, which of these do you think might need an export license? So I've got a computer server, the first item, a laser, second item, an industrial pump, an integrated circuit, and we've got a commercial Land Rover fitted with a military gearbox, and the last one, a motor controller using a frequency changer. You may have some ideas from your business as to which things you might think are controlled and which things won't be controlled. In fact, all of those items could be controlled. It depends on their specifications, it depends on what they can do, but you would need to compare them against the control list that I showed you earlier and see if they're listed on any of those 294 pages. Next slide, please, William. And this is really one of the issues of how can you find your items. Well, you have the PDF list you can search, but there is another tool that you can download from the Export Control Organization website, which is something called the Goods Checker. This uses the same control list, but gives it to you in a form where you can search using keywords or stringing words together to try and find the item in the list. And it will perform that search and will return any results that relate to the words that you've entered to try and narrow down and find the actual entry that relates to your goods. We will be having another webinar where we're going into a bit more detail about searching, and I'll be showing you how you can use this tool. It also incorporates something called the OGEL checker, the Open General Export License Checker, and that's a type of export license. Claire is going to be talking about those in a bit more detail in the next few slides. So thank you, back to you, Claire. Next slide, please, William.
What we want to look at now is how you can plan ahead to determine whether or not those licenses are required. I mentioned earlier something about sanctions. Sanctions are imposed for a variety of reasons, and if a sanction is put into place, what it can often mean is there is a trade restriction with that particular country. But please bear in mind that as well as trade restrictions, the sanctions also do cover such things as moving money around. So that's financial sanctions. It can also cover something called an arms embargo and various other forms of trading restrictions. If any of you don't know what an arms embargo is, I thought I'd just give you a bit of a hint and a tip here. We have on the military list that Trevor was talking about, we call that that's the UK military list. And fundamentally, any item which is included on that UK military list would be something that is subject to an arms embargo. So fundamentally, anything on the military list can't be exported to a particular destination as it's subject to arms embargo. There are other issues which do affect sanctions and trade restrictions. There are a number of countries around the world for which the UK, the EU, don't necessarily agree on the way some of the human rights abuses affect people in that particular country, and we have a human rights register. If countries are on a human rights register, there will be some concerns about what types of equipment is actually going to be exported to that particular country. So first and foremost, I think the issue here is to actually find out whether any of these areas apply to your particular intended export. What countries do you want to export to? And if they are subject to sanctions and embargoes or something like that, you're going to need to apply for an export license. Next slide, please, William. We have a little bit of help. Help is at hand. Again, using the gov.uk website, we've got about 20 odd pages which list all of the countries and their relevant sanctions and embargoes. This is a listing of what all of those different types of sanctions could possibly be, and it will tell you which licenses you will then need to apply for. So please, when you're looking for details about where those sanction destinations are, have a look on gov.uk. Sometimes you might find with gov.uk it's quite a difficult site to navigate around. A little bit of a tip from me is to go into your favourite search engine. I know which mine is. I don't know what yours is. And just put your preferred search term into that search engine. Put gov.uk on the end of it and you'll come up with the page that you're looking for. It's as simple as that. Okay, William, next slide, please. We've mentioned a couple of times during the course of the webinar about this thing called weapons of mass destruction. It can sound like quite a scary thing, and in lots of cases WMD is a scary thing. But to put it into a little bit of context, what is a weapon of mass destruction? It's basically ballistic missiles and the launch systems for ballistic missiles. So it's all the equipment that goes into all of that. And it's all of the things which are counted as anything that can make a chemical weapon, a biological weapon, or anything of a radiological or nuclear nature. There are obviously some regimes around the world that have got nuclear programs. Some of those programs are not civil programs, but they are non-civil nuclear programs. And all of those things together are counted as what we call weapons of mass destruction. Now, clearly, if you're exporting to different countries or different parts of the world, you're not necessarily going to know that your items are going to be for WMD end use. They won't necessarily tell you that when they're targeting you to actually supply them with items. So what you can do, if you've got suspicions about the end use of your equipment, you can apply to the Export Control Organisation for our end use advice service, and we will tell you whether or not you need to apply for a licence. Other ways of finding out about WMD end use is if we actually approach you directly because of information we've had about your specific end user. But certainly, please do take the time to have a look at the pages that we've got on WMD. Next slide, please, William. Because what I want to do now is to really have a look at, if you have got a requirement for a licence, you've worked that out, you've got an item that's on a control list, you're exporting to a country that is in sanction, you want to know, what do I have to do next? There are a number of licenses that you will need to apply for in order to move your goods, your software or your technology, if any of those things apply to you. And these are the main types of licenses that you can apply for. Open general licenses, standard individual or open individual. I'm going to start this off by telling you a little bit about the standard individual licenses. These are by far the most popular types of licenses that companies will apply for. And last year we had something in the region of 5,000 applications for licenses. Sorry about that, I just had a bit of a brain freeze there. We had about 15,500 applications for these types of standard licenses. The licenses are fairly flexible for you. They are valid for a period of up to 2 years, and they are specific to your particular export. So if you have a range of goods that you're exporting to one particular end user in a country, you can have up to 100 items on your export license, and you will simply list those items that need to be licensed on there. Please remember that the licenses have to be supported with a number of different types of documentation, and one of the most important types of documentation that you will be required to supply is something called an end user undertaking, which fundamentally is a certificate from your actual end user to verify that the items will be used for the purposes for which you're sending them over, will not be used for any weapons of mass destruction purposes, and will not be re-exported for any of those particular uses or to a country that's in sanction or embargo. The open individual licenses are similar types of licenses to the standard. They give you a bit more flexibility. You can apply for a number of countries to be added to those licenses, and they're valid for a period of up to 5 years. So they are actually very, very flexible types of licenses that you can apply for. Next slide, please, William. Next slide that we're actually going to be talking about will give you another shot of the gov.uk website. It's going to show you the site where we've got open general licenses. we list all of the licenses that we have that you can register for on Open General Licenses. To give you an overview of what they are a predetermined license, so they're not bespoke to your particular export. They are a predetermined license. They operate on the basis of permitted goods. So there will be a listing of control list entries under which, if your item falls, you may be able to use that license. You will also need to check that the country to which you want to export to is either a permitted destination or is not listed as a non-permitted destination. You need to check all of that out before you can decide whether you can use that license. Fundamentally, you need to check that your items are actually listed as permitted goods. Now, if you want to use these licenses, what it actually means is that you haven't got an export license to show to customs, so you'll need to annotate on your single administration document that you're using these Open General Licenses to export your items. It's a registration that's made on our spire system, our spire electronic licensing system, and once you're registered for them, you can continue to use them. On my next slide, I've actually got a picture of what an export license looks like, one of these Open General Export Licenses. My advice to you on using those licenses would be to say, please download the license that you want to use and read the terms of that actual license. You'll find that the licenses will cover different types of activity. So for instance, if you're sending your items out to an exhibition, you may be able to use these licenses. If you want to mend some items for goods that you've already exported and you want to re-export the items after you've mended them, there will be a particular license that you can use for those. So there's a range of licenses that you can actually use for the open licenses. The benefit of registering for these licenses is that you will get a regular visit from our compliance officers, so you can have a chat to them about how you're using those licenses and the other types of licenses, and they'll check that you're using them in the right way. If you're not, the compliance officer will advise you of where you've actually made a mistake. They'll send details after the visit of your non-compliance and will advise you what you have to do to become compliant. If you've made a very serious error on the use of those licenses, they will advise you how to make a voluntary declaration to customs. If we can go on to the next slide. The next slide is a screenshot of applying on Spire. And Spire is the portal through which all license applications are actually made and where you actually register for open licenses. My main tips on the use of Spire are that you should always complete the screen that says Manage My Registration, because by then you can get all details of your company downloaded into Spire all at the same time, and then Spire will automatically use that information to populate your licenses as you make your license applications. You should also allocate 1 or 2 main contacts to use who will be making the license applications, so that you can keep a track of what license applications are in this system and whether you've got any follow-up inquiries. And if you know that one person is going to be out of the office for a while, to move the Spire responsibility to somebody else. Some of you may have heard that we are looking at the moment at another addition to Spire, but this isn't coming online for the next few weeks, few months, so we'll be available in 2017. If you need training in Spire, we are actually going to be doing a webinar later in this series on how to use Spire. Just to let you know, the next slide is actually a screenshot of our training that we've got on YouTube. We've actually got some e-learning on YouTube on how to use licenses, open licenses, and you're very welcome to access that information. And finally, the slide that I've got available is one that's called Help and Advice, and this is actually quite valuable because I recognise that Trevor and I have gone through quite a lot of information this afternoon fairly quickly. We've covered a lot of things. What I would like to do is point you in the direction of the gov.uk pages. You can access all of them using your search engine. We've got a page on export control itself, export control organisation, and you can actually get access to all of the different guides that we've got on the gov.uk website. We also have a subscription service called Notices to Exporters. These are notices that we publish on a not regular basis. You probably get about 40 a year, so you're not going to be overloaded with them. But they're quite useful tools because they'll give you information about any changes that are being made to the control list, whether there are new open licenses that have been put into the system, and really keep you updated on the legislation and elements of export control. It's a free subscription service. We also run quite a few training courses. These are generally classroom based, and we run them in London and in the regions. So if any of you want to apply for those, we've got a training site on the export control gov.uk pages. And the next thing we have, which I think could be useful to you, is statistics. When you're doing your market research, we've actually got a field of export control statistics, so you can see the level of licenses that we're and the number of licenses that we're issuing to particular countries, and the types of control list entries which are being sold to those particular countries. Anyway, I think I've completed all of that now in terms of the help and advice that we can give, but I'm sure that we can now throw it open to questions.
Right. We've had a question from Peter Satchwell, and he's asking, is the end user advisory service now running on Spire again?
Yes, the end user advice service is up and running on Spire. You can use that at any time. The service that we had to take down was actually called the classification service. We can't run that at the moment, but the end user advice service is definitely available. So when you go onto Spire, go into the portal that says other services other than export licensing, and just register for the end user advice service. We'll just ask you for some basic information on the end user that you want to check out with some details, and then we'll get back to you on Spire.
Thank you, that was very comprehensive. Right, I've got another question from a Harbinder Bogal. He's asking, what if we are exporters of dual-use goods that do not originate in the UK and are shipped from another country? Do we need EC approval?
I've got two answers really to that question. The first one, if goods in the UK that have come from another country, it doesn't actually matter where they have come from. If you're exporting them from the UK, you need to make sure you are fully compliant with UK export rules. And if they're on the dual use list, then you will need to decide where they're going as to whether you would need a license or not. Under the EU or EC dual use items regulation, for most dual use items, you do not need a license for transfer within Europe, within the European Union, but you will need a license if they go outside. The other possibility from your question is if you are what's called brokering dual-use items. That would mean they're coming from one third country and going to another third country. The controls on that would only apply if they are destined for weapons of mass destruction end use. But apart from that, then the dual-use items regulation doesn't take up any other powers on brokering of that type. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. Right, I'll try to go through these in the order I got them through. Michael Rukin asks, with regard to software or technology exports, does use of remote servers based overseas count as an export?
That's a complex issue that's being discussed right now. It will depend on who has access to that information when it goes on to the server that is abroad. If the information that's on a server is protected and it is not being downloaded to anyone other than administrators who are based in the UK, then it probably would not be seen as an export. But in all other cases, it would be seen as an export. I think really what best practice is at the moment is that companies who have any controlled software or technology are tending to keep it on servers that are based inside the UK, just to be certain. But as I say, it's an area that is currently being discussed as far as export controls are concerned. It's something that is moving, obviously, with cloud computing coming on board more and more. It's something that is being discussed and determination being made on it. So that's, as a rule of thumb, that's it. But if anyone from abroad can get access to that information on a server, then it's generally seen as an export at that point.
We did actually run a training course on something like this last year, and we ran it with CESG. We are anticipating running a training course again this year. It will cover the issues of cloud computing, and we'll have a couple of our regime experts that will be coming to talk about it. I can keep you informed of when the training course will take place, and we'll also be issuing it in our training bulletin.
Right, we've got another question from a Peter Kerno-Ford. He's asking, why, having obtained a license to export a product to one English-speaking country, why is it then necessary to obtain a new license for a second English-speaking country, possibly with the same customer and for the same application?
So your license has been obtained for one particular country.
Yep.
And one particular end user. And the question, just to clarify, that you've got another customer in the same country?
Possibly the same customer, but in a different country.
Possibly the same customer, but in a different country. Well, the license will be valid for an export to a particular end user in a specific destination. So if the goods are going to be going to two countries, you will actually need to have two different licenses.
Yeah. I mean, I think the point here is if you have that situation, so you've obtained a standard individual license for your goods to that one customer in a country, that's fine. If you then want to export the same goods but to a different country, that's a different application, and you would need to send in a completely new standard individual application. The other type of license that Claire spoke about, the open individual license, is something that may be more suited to this circumstance, where the license will allow you to send certain goods, and it can be more than one item, to certain destinations. So you might get a license to send 5 items from your product range to 10 different countries. And then once you have that license, you don't need to refer back to the export control organisation each time, but you will need to keep records, and they will be checked by a compliance officer periodically. So it sounds as if you might find it advisable to try and find out if an open individual license would be the right type of license for you if you're exporting in this way.
Brilliant, that's fine. Sounds good, right.
I have got just a bit to add to that, because this is a very high-level webinar today. What we haven't done is gone into any of the criteria that these licenses are actually assessed against. And it's fair to say that each of the licenses that come in get assessed against the issues of whether there are any international obligations that the UK would be breaching in issuing the licenses, whether there's any human rights issues in the country of concern, whether there's things, for example, like a risk of diversion, moving the goods from a particular country to a different end user completely, and there's a risk there about what they're going to be using it for. And where those risks are at play, that can all have an impact on whether a license is issued. So they are very much issued on the basis of of who's going to be using the goods and where they're going to be going to. But this was why I really wanted you to have a look, first of all, at the open general licenses and see whether or not any of those licenses were applicable to the markets to which you want to send your goods to.
Thank you, that was a really great answer. Right, we've got Stuart Farr, who's asked quite a specific question here, but I think it's quite interesting. He's asking, if an item which was originally designed for industrial or commercial use is ordered for a military application with a specific specification change relating to change of colour only, would this item subsequently be considered a military item requiring an export licence?
Yes, that's an interesting question that comes up quite often, actually, and it really depends what the change is. As a general rule, if all you've done is changed an item and it was painted white and now it's painted green, there's nothing special about the paint, then it would still remain as a commercial item. I just take the view that think about what would happen if you exported the item and then you exported the paint that's going to go on it. And if neither of those are licensable, then that would stay the same. However, there are some caveats to that, because in some instances, if you change the colour of an item, it can change its functionality. And so if you think of something like an aircraft head-up display, which may have a green phosphor on it for one application, if someone asks for that to be in amber or some other colour, that can change the operational characteristics. So, it's difficult to give a complete answer to, or a total answer to this. It will depend on the circumstances. But in general, just an ordinary change of a colour, painting something different, if it has no material influence on how it's used, probably wouldn't change it. If it does change how it operates, then it would be a modification to military use and may well push that item into being a military item.
All right, thank you very much. Right, I have a question. I'll read this one out to you as well. It's with reference to human rights records. What are the trade procedures to supply countries like Saudi Arabia, for instance, that are under no sanctions, yet have a massive human rights violation record?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question, and it's quite topical. Saudi Arabia at the moment. One thing to bear in mind with a country like Saudi Arabia, obviously, is its geography, whereabouts it's based, who its neighbours are, the situation. It's got a free port in Saudi Arabia. So those are just some of the things to bear in mind about Saudi. There are licences which are being issued for Saudi Arabia. But all of the licenses that come into the export license system are actually assessed, as I said before, against the set of criteria. And it's quite a robust set of criteria that they're all assessed against. And one of those is whether or not there are any risks for those goods being used against the human rights agenda. We will look at every case on a case-by-case basis. So certainly for somewhere like Saudi Arabia, that is an issue, and the licence will be assessed on that basis.
Thank you very much. On a very similar topic, we're getting quite a few people asking about the Iran situation.
Okay.
I think people know that Iran appears to have come in from the cold recently, and they're wondering, what they can and can't do with regards to Iran.
Okay. Yeah. Again, a very topical issue, and I myself was in Cardiff last week, actually, talking to a big group of exporters over there that had interests in Iran. UKTI at the moment are working very closely with us and with the Foreign Office to have a look at the opportunities that are available in the Iran market. I think it's fair to say with Iran, what we've got here is a market that potentially has great opportunities for companies. Following the implementation date of the agreement on the sanctions, the nuclear sanctions, that was in January, it's meant that there have been a number of sanctions which have been reduced and eliminated. Some of those sanctions are fundamentally related to things like the oil and gas sector, because there was a whole load of sanctions put on Iran as a result of the nuclear sanctions that related to oil and gas equipment and materials. Those sanctions have now been relaxed. But there are still quite a few other sanctions that remain in place on Iran, and that's something that we do need to bear in mind. There's an existing arms embargo, and there's a number of other different sanctions. These things change all of the time, and I think that what you should do if you're looking at trading with Iran is really keep up to date with what's on the gov.uk pages. We update those fairly regularly. One of the big things about trading in Iran actually is the question of getting paid. To be brutally honest, the financial sanctions have moved on, but the banks themselves are cautious about the Iranian market, and therefore you would need to find ways of actually being able to finance your export. Although I understand that UK Export Finance, the old ECGD, has actually raised its cover for Iran. So these are all issues that, if you're interested in that particular market, I would say keep up to date with the latest things and have a look at the Iran page on gov.uk.
Thanks very much. I think that's answered an awful lot of people's questions. Got another question here from Smart Methoni. And they're asking, there are times when an item or kit does not fall into a list category, but have components in them that may make them controlled. How do you deal with such things?
Okay, so I think I'm understanding that there is a kit of parts for something that you're exporting. First point is that whenever you're considering something against the control list, you first of all look at the item itself. So you don't always need to, for a larger item, drop it down into its bill of material and then look at each and every part that's on there to see if it requires an export license. You're looking at what the overall item is. Where this sometimes causes a problem is where you may have a kit of parts that's exported at different times in different places. In that case, what the export would appear to be is perhaps one part of that kit that is a licensable item. If that's the case, then generally you will probably need to make sure that you have export cover for those particular items, because they will almost be seen as a separate entity, separate export. The other way of dealing with that is that you may be able to get an overall license that covers the whole of the kit, the whole of the item, as an overall item, and get a license for that. In which case you could then export the separate parts from different ports or at different times against that license as one of the parts of the kit. But it depends a lot on what that kit is, the overall function of it is, and then comparing that against the list, and then deciding whether you need a license for it or whether you don't.
Does that help?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've answered the question, but that's my.
Well, hopefully that was the question. Somebody sent it. Right, I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap up. Kathleen Pellot asks, is military training, design, know-how, manufacturing and so on included under the definition of technology and controlled under the military goods list as well as the dual-use items list?
Yes, is the short answer to that. Any technology that will relate to the items themselves, and that could be technology is generally split into three. It's in development, it's in production, or it's in use, and they are terms that are defined in the export control list. And so if you undertake any of those activities that relate to that, then they will be controlled. So I think you mentioned training, any sort of production advice will be controlled. So it's anything in which you're assisting someone to manufacture or to use that particular military item, and that's where the technology would be covered.
Great, thanks very much for that final answer. Right, we've just about run out of time. I'd just like to add, we'll be putting all of the unanswered questions on our Ask the Export section in our forums on Open to Export. Our next webinar will be on April the 12th at 2 p.m. and it's entitled, How Do I Know If My Goods Are on a Control List? We've got another one 2 days later on what license do I need to export, and another one on the 26th of April, which is called Applying for an Export License, What You Need to Know. Once again, thank you very much for your forbearance, and to all those exporters out there, please don't forget you can win £3,000 to grow your business overseas by entering our Export Action Plan, which you can find linked from the front page of our website. Thank you, everybody.